Hi everyone, it's Lindsay. Welcome back to another video. I have a fun one for you today. We're going to be heat setting light and fluffy modeling paste. So if you are unfamiliar with light and fluffy modeling paste, this is from the Crafters Workshop. It's their version of kind of like an embossing paste, a very light, airy medium, a lot of fun to work with, and a lot of things you can do with it. If I could suggest one medium to have in your craft room, it would be this. You can add it just for texture on backgrounds through a stencil like I did here. You can add color to it so many different ways. I have a video on that. I will leave it linked down below. It's also great to add over patterned papers to just add a little extra something to them. You can also add it to die cuts like cupcake frosting and clouds to add texture and fun little variations on them. Now, like I said, if I could suggest one kind of paste medium to have in your craft room, it would be this. So, another great thing you can do with it is heat set it, and it does a really cool thing, which I want to show you. The first thing you need to do, though, is put it through a stencil. I am using the Crafters Workshop stencil. This is the new Grid View stencil. It's one of my favorites. I love texture on backgrounds, and this is just one of those really great textures to add. But aside from that, I love the edges on this. They're so cool and unique. It's a really, really fun one to have in your craft room. I'm using a palette knife to spread this. If you don't have a palette knife, a credit card will do, but a palette knife is really preferable. You can get into really tight spaces, which is going to be beneficial on my next card. So once you put this through the stencil, it is really fun. Don't forget to wipe off the edges with your fingers so you don't have any sharp pokies on there, but when you heat set it, it puffs. It is the coolest thing to do, and I wanted to show you just a few things you can do with this and have some fun with it. So I'm using my heat tool and just going right over the wet medium. Now, if you do this dry, it's not going to work. It has to be wet. I like to start, let my heat gun heat up for maybe a minute, and then bring it to my cardstock. Now, as you're moving this around, keep it moving. Don't hold it on any one spot too long. This will burn. And once it puffs, as you can see in this video, you can clearly see it puffing. Once it puffs, move on to the next spot. You don't want to hold it over. This can burn, and I have burned it before, and it doesn't make a pretty color. Unless you wanted to make something like a toasted marshmallow die cut, that could be really cool to maybe burn it then, but even then, be careful. Don't light your craft room on fire. That's not fun for anybody. So once I have it heat set on the front, I like to take my heat gun to the back, give it a little drying to make sure it's dry back there, and then look at that fun texture. It is so cool, and it's really fun to feel. It's more smooth than when you let it dry, and it just creates these little puffs. It is the neatest thing to watch and to just have fun playing with that texture on your backgrounds. So I did white. The modeling paste is white, or the light and fluffy paste is white, and I just kept that on a white background. Now I kept this super simple. Over the top, I added a circle die cut with craft cardstock, and I used the Stamp Market Succulent stamp set to stamp and color this little cute guy that I placed on the circle die cut. I added a thank you sentiment that I stamped in black ink, and then I added a few jewels from Cat Scrappiness. These are the green jewels. For the stamping of the little guy, the little plant, I used VersaFine Clear ink. I used Memento Tuxedo Black on the pot and colored that in with alcohol markers. Super, super simple card. So my next card, again, I'm working on white cardstock, and I'm using this stencil from the Crafters Workshop. I thought this one would be fun to make a little scene and do a little mixing and matching with my mediums here. I have a video all about making scenes with your stencils, and also a video all about ink blending where I go over the different ink blending tools. I'm going to leave those linked down below because in it I share these fantastic tools which I am using right here. I love to use these tools in really tight, confined spaces where I just want a certain ink color. They're especially helpful when you're doing something like scene making with your stencils. So for my leaves, or for the stalks on these flowers, I am using VersaFine Clear in Rainforest. Now, the ink is super important in this case because it is a pigment ink. It doesn't mix well with your light and fluffy modeling paste. Dye inks mix really well, and if you put those next to the paste, it's going to absorb that color, and we don't want that. We don't want that color to move on the stalks of these flowers. So I finished up putting the ink through that stencil, and now I need to clean off that stencil. Now, because I use VersaFine Clear inks, I use alcohol to clean this off of my stencils. If you use water on these, it kind of seizes up the ink and it doesn't want to move. So just a little tip there, if you're using your VersaFine Clears, use alcohol to clean that off your stencils. It works so much better. Now I can reposition that stencil right over the top super easily. You can see through it. It's very easy to do. And now I'm going to mix up my light and fluffy modeling paste with some dye inks. Like I said, it works really well to mix your dye inks with your light and fluffy modeling paste. That's a good and a bad thing here. You want the pigment ink where you don't want the ink to move, or you don't want it to transfer to the paste. But when you do want it to mix, use your water-based inks, your dye inks here. So I like to mix these up on a little palette. I just have a piece of plastic sheeting here. It's a stencil blank, and I'll just mix that up with my palette knife. I'm using Sugar Lavender ink from Catherine Pooler. It's a great, really kind of rustic looking purple. Now this is where having a palette knife with a super fine tip comes in handy, because I want that purple paste now to just be where the tops of the flowers are. With this palette knife, I can really, really, really control where this is being placed and not go over any of those leaves on the bottoms of the flowers. Now, I'm going pretty heavy with this. You can go as thick or as thin as you want, and this technique will still work. It's just going to alter the amount of puff you get. So the thinner your layer, the less puff, the thicker, the bigger the puff is going to be. It also takes a little bit more time for the puff to happen whenever you have a thicker layer because you're adding more product on, which takes longer for it to dry. So whereas the last kind of round of heat setting went fairly quickly, this one is going to take a little bit longer because it takes longer for all of that paste to heat up because I'm putting on that thicker layer. As I'm adding this, I'm also adding a little bit of texture with my palette knife, which is great with this paste. It doesn't flop back down. It's going to hold its texture. So if you wanted to create little spikies, you can create little spikies. A lot of different things you can do with this. And then of course I can remove my stencil once this is on, and I've got the tops of flowers. Now this is great as is, but I really wanted those flower tops to poke out and have even more dimension. So I'm going to heat set them with my heat tool. Now as you add more color, the puffing is going to get a little bit harder to see when it's done. This one not so much as my third card, which I'll show you in just a moment. But keep an eye on it. Don't overdo it. Don't burn your inks, especially with something like this. It's just not going to be a pretty look. I'll continue to hold my heat gun close and just wait for that puffing to happen. Now, like I said, this is a thicker layer of medium, so it's going to take a little bit longer for it to puff up. And that's okay. Don't get worried. Just know once it puffs, move on. Don't overdo it. And this is something that you do want to keep an eye on as you're heat setting it. You don't want to kind of look away because it can happen fairly quickly with the burning. So I'll continue to move this and finish up my last little flowers off to the left-hand side. And these, I added quite a bit of texture paste, so they are really going to puff up, which is such a neat look. It just makes them look like they're popping off the paper, which is so, so cool. And once this is dry, this doesn't push down. I mean, unless you give it some really good pressure, like with a book over the top of it, it does stay puffed up. It doesn't deflate later on, which is a fun little thing. Now, once I have the front done, I do like to hit it from the back, like I said, and look at that. You can really see those popping off the page, the cardstock. It looks like I've added some sort of like Nuvo drop or something, but it's just that texture paste and some heat added to it. Such a neat little technique. Before I move on to the finished card, I do want to give you a few close-ups of the leaves of these flowers and just how much dimension you get with adding just a little bit more paste to it and puffing it up with the heat tool. It's so cool to watch. Now moving on to the finished card. I wanted to add a sentiment, but I didn't have enough space for a stamp sentiment, so I went with a die cut. I used this thanks from Happy Doodle and layered it up several times and just glued them together to create that chipboard effect. I added that to the bottom left-hand corner. I matted my piece, my stenciled piece, with some craft cardstock and attached that to an A2 side folding card base. I also added some cat scrappiness jewels. These are the clear jewels. Now moving on to my third and final card. I wanted to talk more about adding the paste over a background that you might have ink blended already. Now again, that paste will move a dye ink. So if you want to do any stamp layer or stencil layering or layer up different patterns and textures, make sure you're using something that's not going to move if you don't want it to. I'm using my VersaFine Clear Pigment inks because I know they're not going to move underneath that paste as I put it over the top. I am using two different colors here, a green and a yellow. I can't remember their exact names, but to use these or to put these on, I find these jumbo sponge daubers to be really, really helpful. These don't go on great with a brush, but you have a little bit more control with your fingertips using these sponge daubers, so it's a great alternative to kind of brushes to put on those pigment inks onto your background. Now, to my paste, I'm going to be adding something that I did not know if it would work, but these are the color bursts from the Crafters Workshop and Ken Oliver. These come in packs of 3s. They're color coordinated, and they are just so much fun to play around with. I'll leave a link down below on how you use these. These are basically just powder watercolors, but they're very, very, very concentrated in pigment. When you add them to the modeling paste and mix it together, you can get some super vibrant colors. Just it takes a little bit of elbow grease to get these mixed together because it is a powder form. Once it's thoroughly mixed, I'll be putting it through this stencil from the Crafters Workshop. This is another one of my new favorites because it just adds so much texture to your backgrounds, which I love. This is a great one to have for layering. It's nice and large, it covers a good surface area, and it's super fun and gorgeous. So I'm putting this on in a kind of medium layer, I guess I would say. And then once I feel like it is completely covered and even, I can go ahead and peel off the stencil. And I've got this fun background. You could leave it as is, but of course I'm going to add a heat and puff this up. Now with the finer details and the less amount of the paste you put on, the harder it is to tell when your puffing is done. So I am going to get really close up here to see. You might see my head in a few shots, but I will continue just to move my heat tool around and puff up that medium, even all those little fine details like the stems of these leaves and just all the little fine details of those flowers. Again, continue to move that heat tool. Don't keep it in one space too long. Even if it hasn't puffed up yet, but you feel like you've held it there for a long time, move to another spot and come back. It'll be ready in just a few more seconds. Again, hit it from the back. And then I've got this gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous background that has those little puffed up, tiny detailed pieces. I love that even the tiniest details on this stencil get puffed. Again, I kept this card super simple. I wanted the focus to be on that background, which is very fun and textured. So I took this Hugs die from Happy Doodle again, cut it about 3 or 4 times from black cardstock, and layered those up, glued them together to create that chipboard effect. To make sure it stood out from the background a little bit, I added a vellum banner behind it, which is a great little tip if you don't want to cover up the background, but you need a little separation. I matted that with some black cardstock and attached the whole thing to a card base to complete that card. So, this is a really, really, really fun technique to use. And it's just another way to use the light and fluffy modeling paste. Be sure to head down to the description box. I'm going to have a lot of different videos down there. Even the cards I showed before, I'll leave those videos linked down below as well, so you can see all the different ways I use this paste in my card making, so you're not left with just one technique that you can use with one product. That is going to do it for me today. Be sure to check out the description box below. Thanks for watching and happy crafting.